There is a specific kind of quiet that follows a long marriage. It is not the ordinary quiet of an empty room. It is something heavier than that. Something with a shape and a weight that the people who have not lived it cannot fully imagine. It sits in the chair across from you at breakfast. It stands in the kitchen at the time the coffee used to be made for two. It follows you through every room of a house that used to hold two lives and now holds only one, and the echo of everything the second life left behind. Most people who lose a partner after many decades describe learning to live inside that quiet as the hardest thing they have ever done. Some of them never fully manage it. And then there are the rare spouses, the ones who saw it coming, who looked at the quiet waiting on the other side of their own life and decided they were going to do something about it, who find a way to reach across the line between here and gone and fill the silence one more time. Steve Harvey has hosted Family Feud through thousands of episodes. He has been surprised, moved, and genuinely undone by what families reveal under studio lights. He has stood on that stage and felt things he did not plan to feel and said things he did not plan to say. But on a Tuesday afternoon in June 2024 in Atlanta, Georgia, a 96-year-old retired carpenter from Mobile, Alabama reached into the pocket of his Sunday suit jacket and removed something small enough to fit in one hand. A small silver device, not much bigger than a matchbox, with a single button on the front. He told Steve Harvey what it was. He told him what was on it. He told him who had put it there. And Steve Harvey, the man who has made a career out of always having something to say, sat in his chair on his own stage and cried in the open, uncomplicated way of a man who has simply run out of the capacity to do anything else. This is the story of George and Mabel Washington. And it begins the way all the best love stories begin. Not with a dramatic moment, but with an ordinary Tuesday that quietly changed everything. George Edward Washington was born in 1928 in Mobile, Alabama, the third of 5 children. His father worked the docks at the port of Mobile and his mother took in sewing, and the house they lived in was small but solid, built by George's grandfather with his own hands from timber he had milled himself on a piece of land that the family had held since Reconstruction. The house was the thing George grew up understanding above all other things, not as property, not as an asset, as proof. Proof that his grandfather had been here, had worked this land, had built something real with his hands that the weather and the years had not been able to take down. George would run his hand along the door frames as a child, the way other children touched family photographs, like it was a way of touching the person who made it. His father told him once, standing in the doorway of that house in the late afternoon, that a man who builds with his hands builds with his whole life. That what you put your hands to is what you leave behind when your hands are no longer here. George never forgot it. He apprenticed with a carpenter in Mobile at 16. By the time he was 22, he was working independently, building and repairing houses across Mobile County with a precision and care that produced the particular reputation that builds slowly and means the most, the one where people called him specifically, waited for him specifically, and told their neighbors his name without being asked. He was not a large-scale builder. He did not construct office buildings or shopping centers. He built homes, porches and kitchens and children's bedrooms, and additions for families that had grown beyond the space they started with. He built things for people to live inside, and he did it with the understanding that a house is not just structure, it is the container of a life, and what you put into it deserves to be done right. He built houses in Mobile for 41 years. He retired in 1991 at the age of 63, with hands that carried the particular texture of 4 decades of honest work and a reputation in his community that was, by any measure, the most valuable thing he owned. He met Mabel Christine Jones in 1951 at the First Baptist Church of Mobile. She was 23 years old. She sang in the choir, had sung in the choir since she was 9 years old, had been the choir director since she was 21, and conducted the choir the way she did everything, with complete conviction and not one unnecessary motion. She was small and precise, and when she raised her hands in front of that choir, 30 voices did exactly what she intended, every time. George was not a regular churchgoer. He had come that Sunday with his cousin, who had insisted. He sat in the third pew from the back, and he heard Mabel Washington's voice. She was leading a solo section that morning, and he did not move for 4 minutes. He had heard singing before. He had been in churches before. He had not heard anything like that. He introduced himself after the service at the steps. Mabel was polite, formal, and gave him nothing extra. She had been raised by a Baptist minister, and she had both his moral clarity and his complete absence of sentimentality about people who introduce themselves on church steps. George came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and every Sunday for 4 months. On the 5th month, Mabel looked up from her hymnal during the service, found him in his pew, and gave him for one brief, deliberate moment a look that a man does not misread if he is paying attention. George Washington was paying attention. He asked her to dinner the following week. She said yes in the tone of a woman who had been waiting for the question and was prepared to be gracious about the time it had taken. They were married in April 1952. The choir sang at the wedding. Mabel had chosen every hymn herself, rehearsed the choir 3 times that week, and stood at the altar in a white dress she had sewn with her own mother's help, while simultaneously conducting the processional from memory with the smallest possible movements of her left hand that only the choir could see. George thought that was the most remarkable thing he had ever witnessed. He was not wrong. They built a life in Mobile with the same deliberate attention that each of them brought to everything they loved. George built them a house himself. It took him 18 months because he kept finding ways to make it better. Mabel directed the choir at First Baptist for 44 years. They raised 2 children, their daughter Lorraine and their son Dennis. They watched Dennis move to Houston for work in 1985 and get on the phone every Sunday. They watched Lorraine stay in Mobile, marry a good man, and give them 3 grandchildren who grew up knowing that their grandmother's house on Elm Street was the fixed center of everything that mattered. They were married for 72 years. In the summer of 2023, Mabel was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer. She was 95 years old. She had been managing symptoms for several months before telling anyone, which was completely consistent with who she had always been. She told the doctor, she told George, she told Lorraine, and she told them in that order, calmly, with a folder she had already prepared that contained her medical history, her list of questions, and a notepad for the answers. She received the diagnosis the way she had always received difficult information. She was still. She processed. She did not perform distress, because distress was not useful, and Mabel Washington had never had patience for things that were not useful. She went home. She sat in the living room of the house George had built for her in 1954, the house they had lived in for 70 years. And she looked around at the walls and the door frames and the windows, and then she looked at her husband. "George," she said, "I want to talk to you about what comes after." He did not want to have the conversation. He was 95 years old and in the way of certain people who have sustained themselves on routine and will and a refusal to be broken. He was not prepared to face the shape of what she was saying. "I'm not going anywhere yet," he said. "No," she agreed, "but eventually. And there are things I want to handle before then." She folded her hands in her lap the way she folded her hands when she had something important to say. "What I am thinking about is the quiet." He looked at her. "The quiet that will come," she said. "After I know you, George, you are not a man who does well in silence. You never have been. You fill silence with work, and you will not be able to work indefinitely. And then the quiet will come." She paused. "I want to do something about that." He started to answer. She raised one hand slightly. "I am not finished," she said. She was never finished until she was finished. He had known that for 72 years. Over the following weeks, while she was beginning treatment, and while George was driving her to appointments and staying close in the way of a man who shows love through proximity and usefulness, Mabel was doing something in the evenings that she did not tell him about. Their granddaughter Kezia, Lorraine's youngest, 24 years old, studying audio production at a college in Mobile, had come to stay with them to help during Mabel's treatment. She was quiet and competent and had the particular capability of young people who understand technology well enough that it feels like a natural extension of thought. Mabel asked her one evening, after George had gone to bed, in the low lamplight of the kitchen, if she could help her with something. "I want to record my voice," Mabel said. "Properly, not on a telephone. Something that will last. Something clean and clear." Kezia looked at her grandmother. "What do you want to record?" she asked. "Several things," Mabel said. She had a list on a piece of paper folded into quarters, which she unfolded on the kitchen table between them. Kezia looked at the list. She looked at her grandmother. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, Grandma, let's do it." They recorded over 4 separate evenings while George slept. Kezia set up her portable audio equipment at the kitchen table, and Mabel sat across from her with her list, and she recorded in the same focused, unhurried way she had conducted the choir for 44 years. With complete conviction and not one unnecessary word. She recorded herself reading the vows she and George had spoken in April 1952. Not from a copy she had found, from memory. She had remembered them word for 72 years the way she remembered every hymn she had ever directed. She recorded herself reading 6 love letters that George had written to her in the early years of their marriage. Letters she had kept in a cedar box in the bedroom closet for 70 years, the letters a young carpenter had written to a choir director in the careful handwriting of a man who was not practiced at writing letters, but had something important enough to say that he kept trying. She recorded herself reading the 23rd Psalm, the psalm that had been read at their wedding, at Dennis's wedding, at her own mother's funeral, at every turning point in their family's life for 3 generations. She recorded herself singing one hymn. The hymn the choir had sung at their wedding in April 1952. She sang it alone in the kitchen at midnight with Kezia's equipment picking up every note. Her voice thinner now than it had been, the years evident in it, but the pitch certain and the intention absolute, the way it had always been. And last, she recorded herself simply talking. To George. His name in her mouth, the way she had said it 10,000 times. What she wanted him to remember, what she was proud of, what she was grateful for, what she hoped for him in the time he had left. She spoke for 11 minutes. Kezia did not look up from the equipment for the whole of it, because she was not sure she could hold her expression together if she did. When it was done, Mabel folded her list back into quarters. "Can you put it all on something small?" she said. "Something he can hold?" Kezia transferred everything to a small silver device, a voice recorder, the kind that fits in a palm. She showed Mabel how the single button worked. Play and pause. That was all. She charged it and tested it and confirmed that everything was there. Mabel held it in both hands for a moment. Then she went to the closet and found George's Sunday suit jacket, the dark blue one he wore to church, the one he had worn for 20 years, the one that fit him the way a garment fits a person when it has been worn long enough to know them. She put the device in the inside breast pocket. She buttoned the pocket closed. She wrote a note on a small piece of paper in her careful handwriting. She put it in the same pocket, folded once, on top of the device. It said, "For the quiet evenings." Press the button. I am still right here. Mabel, she put the jacket back in the closet and did not mention it again. She passed away in November 2023. She was 95 years old. She died in the bedroom of the house George had built for her in 1954, with the Mobile winter outside the window and George beside her and Lorraine on her other side, and the cedar box with the old letters in the closet nearby. George wore the dark blue Sunday jacket to her funeral. He found the note in the breast pocket when he was dressing that morning. He read it standing in the bedroom in the early morning of the hardest day of his life. He pressed the button, and Mabel's voice came out of the device and said his name. Lorraine had been watching her father with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 30 years as a middle school teacher and knew precisely what a person looked like when they were working very hard not to show how they were doing. George Washington was 96 years old and he was working very hard. He maintained the routine the way he always had, the way he had always maintained structures. Because structures were what held things together. He was up at 6:30 every morning. He made coffee. He sat on the back porch of the house on Elm Street with the Mobile morning coming in through the yard. He went to church on Sundays, sat in his pew, nodded at people who greeted him with the care of a community that was making sure he felt seen without making him feel managed. He did not talk about Mabel in any particular detail. When people asked how he was doing, he said he was doing all right. When Lorraine asked how he was sleeping, he said well enough. When Dennis called from Houston on Sunday evenings, the same Sunday evening call he had made for 40 years, first to both of them, now to his father alone. George asked about Dennis's work and his grandchildren, and did not linger long on any other subject. But Lorraine noticed things. She noticed that the back porch light was on sometimes at 2 in the morning when she drove past on the way home from a late evening. She noticed that he had stopped going to the Thursday morning coffee with his friends from the church, not dramatically, not with explanation, just quietly absented himself from it. She noticed that the lawn, which George had maintained to a precise and particular standard for 60 years, had gotten a little long at the edges. Not neglected, just slightly less than what it had always been. She noticed that every evening at around 9 o'clock, when she called to check in, she could hear something in the background of his voice, not quite music, not quite anything she could identify immediately, that stopped when she called and resumed after they hung up. She did not ask about it directly. She was Mabel's daughter. She understood that some things needed to be arrived at from the side. It was Kezia who finally told her. Kezia had been back in Mobile for a visit in January and had come to the house on Elm Street for dinner. After dinner, as George settled into his chair in the living room, she watched him reach into the chest pocket of his cardigan, a pocket she recognized because she was the one who had placed something in a pocket like it and pressed something. She heard her grandmother's voice come out of the small silver device from across the room. She heard George sit back in his chair. She heard his breathing settle. She watched his face do something that she had not seen it do since the funeral. Not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but something in between that had the particular quality of a person who has found the thing that makes the size of the loss just barely bearable. She went to the kitchen and called her mother. She told her everything. About the evenings at the kitchen table. About the list on the folded piece of paper. About what Mabel had recorded and in what order and why. About the Sunday jacket and the pocket and the note in Mabel's handwriting. Lorraine sat on the kitchen floor of her own house in Mobile, Alabama, and cried for 20 minutes. Then she wiped her face. She stood up. She thought about what her mother had done from the particular angle of a daughter who had watched her mother do things all her life and had never once seen her do something without it being exactly right. And then she did what the situation required. She submitted a Family Feud application in February. She told George about it over Sunday dinner in March. She told him it was something to look forward to. Something to do with the family. Something that would put them all in a car together, going somewhere with a reason. George looked at her over his sweet tea. "The survey program," he said. "Yes, Daddy, with Steve Harvey." "That's right." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, the carpenter's hands. The hands that had built the house they were sitting in. "Mabel liked that program," he said. "She did," Lorraine said carefully. "She always got the answers before the contestants did," he said. She would say them out loud before they rang in. Most of the time she was right. Lorraine looked at her father. "Then let's go do it for her," she said. George picked up his tea. "All right," he said. "Who else is coming?" The team was 4. George. Lorraine. Lorraine's husband Raymond, who was 67 and had spent 30 years as a high school football coach and had the calm authority of a man who had spent his career helping young people do hard things they did not believe they could do. And Kezia, who had come down from college specifically for the taping because she would not have missed it, and because she carried a particular knowledge that the rest of the family did not carry, and she held it the way her grandmother had taught her to hold important things, steadily, without letting it spill until the right moment. Before they left Mobile, George went to the closet. He took out the dark blue Sunday jacket. He put it on. He checked the breast pocket. The device was there, the way it was always there when he wore this jacket. He buttoned the pocket. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. Then he went to the car. The drive to Atlanta was 6 hours. George sat in the back with Kezia for most of it. He told her about building the house on Elm Street, about the 18 months it took, about the things he had kept changing because he kept finding ways to make them better, about the morning he had handed Mabel the key and she had walked through every room without saying a word, and then stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with the expression he had spent the rest of his life trying to deserve. "She cried?" Kezia asked. "Mabel?" George almost smiled. "No." She looked at the kitchen and she said, "The window is 3 inches too far to the left. The light will be wrong in the afternoons." He paused. She was correct. "I knew it when she said it." "Did you fix it?" "I fixed it the following week." He looked out the window at the Georgia morning going past. She never mentioned it again. She just knew it had been fixed. The way she always knew. Kezia held that in the way she had learned to hold things this year, with both hands, carefully, because it was too valuable to let any part of it go. The studio in Atlanta received George with the specific, genuine warmth that had clearly been communicated down through the right channels. The production team was attentive and unhurried. Steve Harvey's producer came into the green room and shook George's hand and told him it was an honor. Mabel would have said, "Don't make a fuss," George said. "Then we'll try to make it a dignified fuss," the producer said. George considered this. That she would have accepted, he said. The opposing family was the Franklin family from Savannah, 3 generations, energetic and quick, with a grandmother at the center who had clearly also spent time thinking about common survey answers and was not shy about the buzzer. They jumped out early, and the Washington family spent the first 2 rounds chasing them, which was not comfortable but was also not unfamiliar to Raymond, who had spent 30 years coaching teams from behind. He settled them down. The way coaches do, not loudly, not dramatically, just a word here and a look there, and the team remembered what they were capable of. Lorraine was measured and precise. She did not chase points she did not have. She answered what she knew with confidence and let the uncertain ones go. That composure kept the family on the board through the middle rounds when they needed to be on the board. Kezia was quick. She had her grandmother's instinct for reading a room and her grandfather's precision when it mattered, and she got 2 strong answers in the 3rd round that pushed the Washington family into the lead for the first time. George answered twice. Both times he took the question in, turned it over, and gave a single clean answer that was neither fast nor slow but simply right. The number 3 answer on a question about things a man does on a Sunday morning. The number 2 answer on a question about what makes a house a home. He said the people in it for the second one. The board confirmed it at 38 points. The audience responded in the warm, instinctive way of people who have just heard something accurate about their own lives. The Washington family won the main game 329 to 287. Lorraine exhaled all at once. Raymond shook George's hand in the particular way of a man who has been in enough high-stakes moments to know which ones mattered. George smiled. Small, private, the way he had smiled his whole life when something was exactly as it should be. Before Fast Money, Steve Harvey worked his way down the contestant line. He talked to Raymond about coaching. They traded 2 minutes of football that the audience enjoyed. He talked to Lorraine. He talked to Kezia about audio production and made a joke about the future of television that the audience appreciated. Then he walked to George. He moved differently when he got to George. Slower, more deliberate. He pulled the low chair over and sat, the way a man sits when he understands that what is in front of him deserves to be met at the right level. "Sir," he said. "Young man," George said. The audience gave the warm laugh. They always did. It was always earned. 96 years old, Steve said. "Still here," George said. "Still here." "How are you holding up, sir?" Really, George looked at him with the directness of a man who has lived long enough to be done with the answers that cost nothing. "I am holding up," he said. "The way a man holds up when the person who made his life make sense is no longer in it. Some mornings are harder than others. The evenings are the hardest." He paused. "But I have help with the evenings." Steve caught that the way he always caught things, immediately, with the instinct of a man who has spent decades listening for what is underneath what is being said. "What kind of help?" he asked. George Washington looked at him. Then he reached up and unbuttoned the breast pocket of his dark blue Sunday jacket. He reached in. He removed the small silver device and held it on his open palm between them. Steve Harvey looked at the small silver device in George's palm. He looked at the size of it, the plainness of it, the single button on the front. He looked back at George. "What is that?" he asked. Quietly, the way you ask when you already understand it is important. "My wife's voice," George said simply. The studio went completely still. "Mabel recorded herself before she passed," George said. He held the device in his open hand, not presenting it, just holding it the way you hold something you carry because you cannot leave it anywhere. "She did it in secret. On 4 evenings while I was sleeping. Our granddaughter helped her with the equipment." He glanced toward Kezia at the end of the contestant line. Kezia was completely still, her eyes on her great-grandfather. "She recorded our wedding vows. She recorded letters I wrote to her when we were young. Letters I had forgotten I wrote. She recorded a psalm. She recorded herself singing the hymn from our wedding." He paused. "And she recorded herself talking to me. 11 minutes, saying what she needed to say." Steve Harvey was not moving. "She put it in the pocket of this jacket," George said. He pressed his hand flat against his chest, against the pocket. "She put a note with it. She put the note on top of the device where I would find it first." He stopped. His voice remained level, the way a carpenter's hands remain level even when the work is hard, through practice, through will, through an understanding that steady is what the job requires. "I found it the morning of her funeral. I was dressing. I reached in the pocket for a handkerchief and I found the note." Steve's jaw was set. "What did the note say?" he asked, though something in his face suggested he was not entirely sure he was ready for the answer. George looked down at the device in his hand. It said, "For the quiet evenings, press the button. I am still right here." He was quiet for a moment. "Mabel, Steve Harvey put both hands over his face. He sat like that for a moment. Both hands pressed completely over his face, the microphone lowered to his knee. Then, he stood up. He walked 3 steps toward the center of the stage and stopped. He looked at the ceiling. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His shoulders moved once, the single, brief, involuntary movement of a man absorbing something that is larger than what his composure was built to handle. The audience did not make a sound. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned around and walked back to the chair. He sat down. His eyes were wet, and he did not attempt to manage it. He looked at George Washington, 96 years old, in a dark blue Sunday jacket, holding his wife's voice in his open palm, and he breathed. "She put it there before she passed," Steve said. His voice was rough at the edges in the specific way of a man who has given up on sounding composed. "Yes," George said. "She recorded all of it, the vows, the letters, the hymn. And she put it somewhere you would find it on the worst morning of your life." "On the morning of her funeral," George said, "when the quiet was just beginning." Steve exhaled slowly. "How long ago did she pass?" 7 months, George said. "And you have listened to it?" "Every evening," George said, "at 9 o'clock. I sit in my chair and I press the button." He looked at the device. "The whole recording is 43 minutes. I listen to all of it." He paused. "Sometimes I fall asleep before it ends. That is the only time I sleep through the night, when I fall asleep with her voice still going." The sound that came from the audience was not applause and not crying. It was something that had no name, the sound 400 people make when something has gotten all the way inside them and they have no adequate response for it. Lorraine had walked forward from the side of the stage. She stood next to her father with her hand on his shoulder. She was not trying to hold herself together. She had stopped trying several minutes ago. Kezia stood at the end of the contestant line with her hand over her heart, and in her face was the particular expression of a young woman who sat in a kitchen 4 nights with her grandmother's voice going into a recording device, and understood, even then, what she was part of, but had not understood, until this moment, the full weight of what it had become. Raymond stood behind Lorraine with his hand on her back. The football coach in him understood that there were moments that required stillness and not strategy. This was one of them. Steve looked at George for a long time. "Sir," he said, "can I ask, did you know? Before you found the note, did you have any sense that she had done this?" George thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Mabel was the most organized person I ever knew. She kept things in their proper place and she did not reveal the location until the right time." He almost smiled. She directed the choir the same way. She knew what was coming 3 measures before the singers did. She was always 1 step ahead of the moment. "She planned this for you," Steve said. "She thought about the quiet that was coming, the quiet without her, and she found a way to fill it." "She always said silence was for people who had nothing worth saying," George said. "She was never silent in 72 years. He closed his hand gently around the device. "She made sure of that." Steve turned to face the audience directly. He opened his mouth. He stopped. He tried again. "I have done this show," he said, "for a long time. A long time. I have sat across from people in the most vulnerable moments of their lives, moments of joy, moments of grief, moments they did not plan to have on television and then had anyway." He stopped. "And I have never—" He stopped again. He pressed his hand flat over his heart. "I have never heard anything like what this man just told me." He looked back at George. "She used what she had left," Steve said. "Whatever time, whatever energy, whatever was still available to her. She spent it making sure you would not have to face the quiet alone." His voice cracked once, precisely, like a clean break in wood. "She gave you her voice. From the other side of goodbye." so you would have something to hold on to in the evenings when everything else goes still. The audience stood, all at once, without coordination. The way crowds stand when the standing is simply the only available response. George held the device on his palm and looked at it with the expression of a man who has spent 7 months trying to find the right words for what a small silver object has meant to his survival and has not yet found them and may never find them. Because some things are too large for words, and Mabel had understood this, which was why she had used her voice instead. Steve wiped his eyes with the complete absence of self-consciousness of a man who has stopped caring about the cameras. He looked at Lorraine beside her father. "Did you know?" he asked her. "Not until January," she said. "Kezia told me." She glanced at her daughter. Mama kept it between the two of them until it was done. Steve looked at Kezia. "You were there," he said, "for all 4 evenings." "Yes," Kezia said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has been holding something tightly for a long time and is only now, finally, allowing themselves to let go of some of it. "What was she like?" Steve asked. "During the recordings." Kezia thought about it. She was exactly like herself, she said. She wasn't performing. She wasn't being dramatic about it. She sat at the kitchen table with her list. She had made a list of everything she wanted to record, in order, and she went through it the way she used to go through a rehearsal plan. Calm, purposeful, she knew what each thing was for. She paused. When she sang the hymn from the wedding, I had to look away, because I would have fallen apart, and she would have had to stop and take care of me, and that was not what the evening was for. Steve Harvey laughed, the short, wet, involuntary laugh of a man who has been crying and received something unexpectedly funny inside the grief. The audience laughed too. Lorraine laughed. Even George's face did something that in a younger man would have been a laugh. "That sounds like Mabel," George said. "It was entirely Mabel," Kezia said. Steve stood up. He faced the audience one more time. "George Washington built houses in Mobile, Alabama for 41 years, he said. He built his own house with his own hands, and he raised his family inside it, and he loved one woman for 72 years. He shook his head slowly, and that woman, in the last months of her life, sat down in the kitchen with her granddaughter's recording equipment, and she captured her own voice, because she understood something that most of us do not understand until it is too late." He stopped. She understood that love is not finished when the person who carries it is gone. It does not end. It just needs somewhere to go. He looked at George. She gave it somewhere to go. A little silver device in a jacket pocket. 43 minutes of everything she wanted him to carry. He pressed his hand over his eyes for just a moment. "That is the most practical and the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." He could not say anything after that for a moment. The executive producer stepped forward. The $20,000 prize was confirmed. Family Feud was adding an additional contribution, $15,000 in Mabel Washington's name, to the music program at First Baptist Church of Mobile, where she had directed the choir for 44 years. When this was announced, George looked up at the stage lights for a moment in the way of a man looking somewhere private. "She will appreciate that," he said finally. "To no one in particular. To the room. To the lights." She always said the choir needed new risers. The audience laughed through everything they were feeling, which was the only way available to them. George looked down at the device in his hand one more time. Then he put it back in the breast pocket of the dark blue jacket. He buttoned the pocket. He pressed his hand flat against it once, the same way, Lorraine knew, that he pressed his hand against it every evening before he sat down in his chair and pressed the button. Just making sure it was there. Just making sure she was there. The episode aired on a Thursday evening in July. By Friday morning, the clip of George opening his palm to show the small silver device had been viewed 12 million times. By Saturday, it had passed 25 million. It moved with the specific quiet speed of things that are simply and undeniably true, not because they were dramatic, but because they named something real that millions of people had been living with and did not have adequate language for. The comment that circulated the most, appearing beneath every version of every clip, translated within days into 19 languages, had been written by a woman who identified herself only as a widow of 4 years from a small town in Kentucky. I have been trying to explain to people for 4 years what the evenings are like. I could never find the right words. This 96-year-old man just said it in 2 sentences. The quiet has a shape. She built him something to put inside it. I would have given everything to have that. It was shared 11 million times. The response to that comment, from people who had lost spouses, from people who had not lost spouses but had heard something in it that mattered to them, generated a movement that no one had organized or planned. People began making recordings. They called it simply what it was, recording their voice for the people they loved. Not as a death preparation. Not as a morbid exercise. As an act of love that did not wait for crisis to be relevant. Audio production studios in several cities reported significant increases in requests from elderly individuals who wanted to make professional recordings for their families. A technology company developed a small dedicated device, not a phone, not a computer, just a simple voice player with a single button, and donated the first production run to hospice organizations across the country. The device was called the Mabel. Lorraine did not find out about this until a hospice coordinator from Georgia called her in September to ask permission. She sat at her kitchen table in Mobile for a long time after the call ended. Then she called her father. "Daddy," she said, "there is something I need to tell you." George listened. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. "Mabel would say that was unnecessary and excessive," he said finally. "She would," Lorraine agreed. "She would also be very pleased," he said. "Yes," Lorraine said, "she would." The $15,000 contribution to First Baptist's music program covered the new choir risers, the ones Mabel had been noting as necessary for 11 years. The music director had the risers engraved on the back with a small plate, in memory of Mabel Christine Washington, choir director 1953-1997. She knew what was coming 3 measures before everyone else. The first Sunday the choir used the new risers, George was in his pew in the 3rd row. He had been in that pew for 72 years, first beside Mabel, then alone. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, and he listened to the choir fill the church with the particular organized sound of trained voices moving together, and he thought about a woman who had conducted that sound for 44 years with complete conviction and not one unnecessary motion. He thought about her voice on the device in his pocket. He thought about 43 minutes of everything she had wanted him to carry. He thought about the note in her handwriting, "I am still right here." Steve Harvey talked about the Washingtons the Monday after the episode aired. He did not plan a full segment. He brought it up the way things come up when they have not left your mind for 4 days. "I walked off my own stage," he said. "I sat down and stood up and sat down again. On television. In front of an audience." He paused. "Because what that woman did, what Mabel Washington did, is the thing that I did not know was possible and now cannot stop thinking about." He was quiet for a moment. She recorded her voice, her actual voice. She left it where he would find it when the silence started. Not to be remembered, she did not do it to leave a monument. She did it because she knew him. She knew the specific shape of what the evenings were going to be for him, and she decided she was going to be in them anyway. His voice roughened. She found a way to stay. He let that sit. "I have been thinking about what I want to leave," he said finally. "Not money. Not things. What do I want the people I love to be able to reach for when I am not there? He stopped. Mabel Washington answered that question for all of us. Record your voice. Say what you mean. Say the things you might be too busy or too shy or too certain you will have time for later. He paused. Because Mabel was 95 years old and she sat at a kitchen table at midnight, and she made sure. She did not assume there would be time. She made the time. His voice was steady but carrying something beneath it. That is love that does not quit just because the circumstances got hard. George went back to the house on Elm Street. He sat on the back porch with the Mobile morning coming through the yard the way it had come through every morning for 60 years. He drank his coffee. He watched the light come up through the oak tree at the back of the yard, the tree Mabel had planted the year they moved in, the tree that was now taller than the house. At 9 o'clock that evening he sat in his chair. He reached into the breast pocket of his cardigan, the one Kezia had transferred the device to when the Sunday jacket was put away for the week, and he pressed the button. There was a moment of quiet, just a breath of it. And then Mabel's voice came through the small speaker, clear and certain and exactly itself, and said his name the way she had said it for 72 years, like it was important, like it deserved to be said properly, like it was the thing she had decided to say and she meant every syllable of it. George settled back in his chair. He closed his eyes. Most people spend their lives wondering if they were loved well. George Washington did not have to wonder. He had the proof in his pocket. 43 minutes of it. In the voice of the woman who had looked at the quiet coming after her, and decided, with the same conviction and the same precision and the same complete absence of unnecessary motion that had defined her for 72 years, that it was not acceptable, and that she was going to do something about it. She had always been one step ahead of the moment. Even this one